Fallout 5 is finally real. Bethesda has confirmed that the game is now in pre-production and it will be developed on Creation Engine 3, a new technology platform designed to let Bethesda work on multiple major projects at the same time. On paper, this sounds like progress, more games, faster development, longer support, and more Fallout than we've ever seen in years. But after Starfield, more might be exactly what Fallout fans should be worried about, because Starfield was not a game that lacked ambition. It had more planets, more systems, and more possibilities than anything Bethesda had made before, and yet, despite all of it, it struggled to create the kind of memorable world that made people fall in love with Fallout and the Elder Scrolls in the first place. Starfield's problem was not that Bethesda aimed too high, it was that the studio spread its greatest strengths across too much space. And Fallout 5 will show whether Bethesda has finally learned the difference between making a game bigger and making it better. To understand why Starfield became such a warning sign, we first need to understand what Bethesda was actually good at, and it was never simply making big maps. Fallout 3 was enormous for its time, but one of the reasons it was so effective was that its world felt deliberately constructed. You could leave a vault with one objective, begin walking towards it, and become distracted by a ruined building, a strange radio signal, or a group of people asking for help. A simple journey could turn into an entirely different story. The wasteland was not just a space separating one mission from another, the wasteland was the experience. At release, GameSpot described Fallout 3 as less broad than Bethesda's previous games, but more focused and vividly realized. Its choices could influence cities, factions, and the way the players approached the rest of the game. Fallout 4 moved further towards action, crafting, and settlement building, and many players criticized the way it simplified dialogue and role-playing. But Fallout 4 still understood the importance of discovery. There was almost always something around the next corner, an unusual character, a new location, a side quest, or an environmental story hidden inside a destroyed building. The map did not need to be infinite because the world felt dense. GameSpot specifically praised Fallout 4 for its dense world, its wide variety of locations and characters, and the feeling that you never quite knew what would appear around the next bend. That was Bethesda's real strength, not scale by itself, density. The feeling that traveling through one of its worlds would naturally produce stories you had not planned to experience. You were not exploring because a menu had generated an objective. You were exploring because the world made you curious, and then Bethesda decided to build an entire galaxy. Starfield was Bethesda's first new universe in more than 25 years. It was supposed to take the freedom of Skyrim and Fallout and expand it across space, more than 1,000 planets. There were shipbuilding, outposts, crafting, research, scanning, procedural exploration, and even more mechanics. Starfield did not fail because Bethesda was lazy. Quite the opposite. It was one of the most ambitious games the studio had ever attempted, but ambition only works when all of those systems support the same central experience. And in Starfield, they often felt like they were competing for attention instead. The game allowed you to visit hundreds of planets, but many of those planets relied on repeated structures and procedurally placed locations, more commonly known as fishbowls. A location spanning a certain distance in diameter depending on where you clicked on a planet. This meant that the game generated a new instance of the planet where the player would load into, giving the player a new surface to explore. However, this also meant that for it to feel worthwhile going there had to be interesting things to look at for on the planet. With it being procedurally generated, all of that hand-placed details that, in my opinion, Bethesda is great at would be lost, because the planet surfaces that was generated became too vast, having to walk miles to reach certain points of interest with nothing else to do. The introduction of vehicles did help the emptiness, but it still meant that getting there wasn't as interesting as it could have been. Space travel was divided between menus, loading screens, and short transitional sequences, and we all know how the community reacted to those loading screens. If Starfield hadn't spent any money on marketing, the memes on the loading sequences would have been enough to market the game by itself. Some of the game's most important progression involved repeatedly landing on a planet, running towards a temple, and completing almost the same activity again. PC Gamer summarized the contradiction in its original review. Starfield was Bethesda's biggest RPG, but nowhere near its best. The review highlighted repetitive temples, unremarkable planets, and space travel broken apart by menus, cutscenes, and loading screens, and that created a fundamental change in how exploration worked. In Fallout, traveling towards a mission could become a story of its own, but in Starfield, traveling was often something you moved through to reach the story. That distinction might sound small, but it changes almost everything, because Bethesda had technically created more places to explore than ever before, but the process of exploring them was less likely to create something unexpected. Discovery became another system. You would select a planet, choose the landing point, scan the environment, then walk towards a generated structure. You would collect the resources and then return to the ship and rinse and repeat. The problem was not that every planet was empty. Space should feel empty. The problem was that Starfield's enormous scale made it difficult for Bethesda's handcrafted content to define the overall experience. There were still strong quests, characters, and locations, but they were distributed across such a massive structure that the game often struggled to build momentum. Bethesda had created more, but more did not automatically make the universe feel more alive. And that is why Shattered Space mattered so much. The expansion appeared to address one of the biggest criticisms of the base game. Instead of spreading the experience across hundreds of planets, Shattered Space focused primarily on one handcrafted location, the home world of House Va'ruun. It was darker, more concentrated, more mysterious, and much closer to the traditional Bethesda structure players recognized from Fallout and the Elder Scrolls. This should have been the moment where Starfield found its identity, a chance to take the technology and systems of the base game and place them inside a more focused, memorable world. But Shattered Space did not fundamentally change how many people viewed Starfield. The expansion received a Metacritic score of 62 on PC and 58 on Xbox Series X. Even relatively positive reviews often reached the same conclusion. The new setting was an improvement, but the expansion offered few major new gameplay systems and remained fundamentally more Starfield. That is more important than whether the expansion lasted 6 hours, 10 hours, or even 15. The real problem was that players had waited more than a year for Starfield's first major expansion, and it did not provide the transformation many of them were hoping for. Bethesda had made the playable area smaller, but it had not necessarily made the experience deeper. Shattered Space struggled with consequences, character writing, and quests that did not fully use the potential of House Va'ruun or its settings. Some critics found enjoyable side quests and strong environmental design, but the overall response remained mixed, and that exposed something important. Starfield's biggest problems could not be fixed simply by replacing 1,000 planets with one handcrafted map, because the problem was never just the number of planets, it was the way the game's different parts worked together, or more often failed to. Bethesda had originally presented Starfield as a game that would continue evolving. At the end of 2023, the studio said it was targeting updates approximately every 6 weeks, and throughout 2024, Bethesda did deliver meaningful improvements and expanded the game with additions such as city maps, more gameplay systems, improved ship customization, performance options, official mod support, and eventually a land vehicle. But after Shattered Space, something changed. The problem was not that Bethesda literally stopped updating the game. Patches did continue. Creations from both Bethesda and the community continued to be released. Smaller quality of life improvements continued. The problem was that players no longer had a clear understanding of what Starfield was becoming. Bethesda had previously discussed the possibility of regular story expansions and continued long-term support, but following Shattered Space's mixed reception, there was no immediate concrete roadmap showing how the studio planned to address the deeper criticism of the game. For a long period, players heard variations of the same message. Bethesda was working on exciting things. More information would arrive later. The team was still committed, but without a clear destination, that commitment became difficult to see. And after a disappointing expansion, silence is rarely neutral. Players begin filling it with their own assumptions, spinning it into their own headcanons, and that's dangerous. Maybe development had slowed. Maybe Bethesda had shifted its attention towards the Elder Scrolls 6. Maybe Starfield would receive patches and paid creations, but never the kind of substantial evolution that had once been imagined. Eventually, Bethesda did return, but the wait for it wasn't something to be forgotten and still plagues parts of the community to this day. Nonetheless, a few months ago, as of this video, in April of 2026, Starfield received 3 lanes, Terran Armada, and a PlayStation 5 release. 3 lanes substantially changed space travel, added new encounters, and adjusted progression, outpost, equipment, and other systems. Bethesda described it as the game's most expansive free update to date. So it would be wrong to claim that Bethesda abandoned Starfield. The studio says the game has reached more than 17 million players with almost 1 billion hours played, and that additional stories, gameplay improvements, and Starborn content are still planned. But the wording here matters. Players reached is an engagement metric, not a sales figure. It can include people accessing the game through Game Pass, and it tells us very little about how many copies were sold. how much revenue Starfield generated, or whether the game ultimately justified its development and marketing costs. We have seen similar language used elsewhere in the industry. Shortly after the release of Assassin's Creed Shadows, Ubisoft announced that the game had reached 5 million players. That number sounded impressive, but it did not reveal how many copies had actually been sold, how many players had accessed the game through subscription services, or whether the release had met Ubisoft's internal financial expectations. The same caution should therefore be applied to Starfield's 17 million players. It is undeniably a large audience, but it's not evidence on its own that the game was commercially successful. At the same time, the lack of traditional sales figures should not automatically be treated as proof that it underperformed. In fact, the available launch data suggests that Starfield started strongly. It was the best-selling game in the United States during September 2023, became one of the year's biggest releases within weeks, and reportedly drove a record day of new Game Pass subscriptions. The more reasonable criticism is that Microsoft has never provided enough information to evaluate Starfield's financial performance directly. 17 million players sounds impressive, just as 5 million players did for Assassin's Creed Shadows, but without sales, revenue, or profitability figures, neither number tells us whether the game met the expectations attached to it. The clearer signs of Starfield struggling appeared later. Shattered Space generated a relatively small increase in player activity, received poor reviews, and failed to create the renewed momentum that a major expansion would normally be expected to deliver. Starfield may have launched successfully, but its ability to retain attention and establish itself as a long-term franchise appears far less certain. Either way, Bethesda is still fighting for the game, but the fact that some of Starfield's most requested changes arrived years after release illustrates how difficult these problems were to solve. You can add maps, you can add vehicles, you can improve space travel, but it's much harder to rebuild the fundamental relationship between exploration, storytelling, and the world itself, and Bethesda cannot afford to spend years discovering that same problem again with Fallout 5. For many players, the obvious explanation is Creation Engine. Every time a Bethesda game releases with technical problems, awkward animations, or another loading screen, the same argument returns. Bethesda needs to abandon its engine. But the reality is more complicated than that. The Creation Engine is not simply a graphics engine. It is connected to the way Bethesda creates quests, stores objects, simulates NPCs, builds interactive worlds, and supports one of the largest modding communities in gaming. Replacing it would not automatically produce a better Bethesda game. And Creation Engine 3 is not necessarily identical to the technology used for Starfield. Bethesda describes it as a shared platform that has been in development since Starfield's launch, featuring new tools, rendering technology, and systems for the Elder Scrolls 6 and Fallout 5. So the question is not simply whether Bethesda should continue using Creation Engine. The more revealing question is, what is Creation Engine 3 being designed to achieve? In Bethesda's announcement, the studio repeatedly emphasized its ability to bring teams closer together, support multiple projects simultaneously, release games sooner, and support them for longer. That might solve one of Bethesda's biggest problems. Its games take far too long to make, and its franchises disappear for entire console generations, but it also represents the same temptation that shaped Starfield. More teams, more projects, more content, and more support, and more worlds operating simultaneously. None of those things are inherently bad, but they only matter if the individual games receive the focus required to make their worlds worth exploring. Bethesda says the recent restructuring across Xbox has not changed the development roadmap for Elder Scrolls 6, and that distinction matters. The concern is not that these projects will suddenly disappear, it is whether a studio supporting more franchises, live games, and parallel projects can still give each individual world the creative attention it requires. Creation Engine 3 may make that structure more efficient, but efficiency and focus are not necessarily the same thing. A more efficient engine can help Bethesda produce more content. It cannot decide whether that content is meaningful in the end. Fallout 5 is still many years away. The Elder Scrolls 6 remains Bethesda's primary development focus, while Fallout 5 is only in pre-production. But Bethesda is already expanding Fallout in almost every direction. Fallout 76 continues receiving updates. Fallout 3 and New Vegas remasters are being developed. Obsidian is working with Bethesda on another Fallout project. The television series has introduced the franchise to an enormous new audience, and the Creation Engine 3 is intended to let Bethesda support this larger ecosystem more efficiently. Fallout has arguably never been bigger, and that is precisely why Bethesda needs to remember that size was never the reason Fallout worked. Fallout does not need 1000 locations. It needs locations that feel like they exist for a reason. It does not need dozens of disconnected gameplay systems. It needs systems that influence the way players inhabit the world and define their character. It does not need every possible feature. It needs choices that matter, factions worth understanding, and discoveries that could only happen because the players decided to walk in the wrong direction. Fallout 5 can be enormous, but its scale needs to come from the number of meaningful possibilities inside the world, not simply the physical size of the world itself. Starfield demonstrated what Bethesda's technology could create. Fallout 5 needs to demonstrate that Bethesda still understands what those systems are supposed to be used for, because Bethesda's greatest games never felt large because there was an endless amount of space. They felt large because every journey created the possibility of finding something worth remembering. Bethesda has clearly learned some lessons from Starfield. The studio has improved travel, it has changed progression, it has continued supporting the game, and it is building new technologies around the problems it encountered. But Bethesda has always been capable of recognizing individual mistakes. The harder question is whether it understands the pattern connecting them. Starfield did not suffer from a lack of ideas. It suffered because Bethesda tried to make many of those ideas equally important. Shattered Space made the world smaller without completely solving the problem, and Creation Engine 3 now promises to let Bethesda create and support more projects at the same time. That could represent the beginning of a better era for the studio, or it could make Bethesda more efficient at repeating the same mistakes across an even larger number of projects. Fallout 5 does not need to be Bethesda's biggest game. It does not need the largest map, and it doesn't need the most systems, and it does not need to prove the capabilities of the Creation Engine 3. It needs to prove that Bethesda remembers why people wanted to get lost in its worlds in its first place. Because the real test is not whether Bethesda has learned how to make more, it is whether Bethesda has finally learned when more stops making a game better.